Shiyun is a girl who was born with a strangeness. She can see red lines that connect people who have been intimate, that is, people who have done the deed, gotten close, or crossed boundaries. When she was a child, she didn't understand what these lines meant, so she simply drew them like any child would. But when her mother saw that her aunt and her husband were connected, she immediately knew what it was about. That's why, blinded by rage, she ended her husband's life, then ran away and left her daughter alone. Since then, Si-hyun understood that her ability was a curse and that she had to keep her mouth shut. Even so, it was very difficult for her because everyone around her seemed to get hurt, so she decided to take her own life. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't do it. So she locked herself in her house and didn't have contact with anyone for a long time. When she looked out the window, her neighbor across the street noticed she lived alone and brought her fruit to cheer her up. But she didn't want to have contact with anyone to avoid them getting hurt. We meet the detective. He turned out to be a womanizer caught in the act. His girl tells him he should go to her wedding, but he says no because he has principles. After the marriage, there won't be any more disrespect. The girl gets angry and leaves wanting more. Later, we meet his niece, Sona. She was bullied at school and had recently reported the abuse, but the leader of the bullies had wealthy parents, so all they did was give her a warning. That's why now they bullied her even more and demanded money from her to leave her alone. Back to the detective, he had a case to solve. A girl had died alone at home. Everyone thought it was a suicide, but the detective knew something was off because her things were too neatly arranged, as if it were a perfectly planned scene. Also, a man wearing a helmet had come in to deliver an order, so he was the main suspect. In addition, there were similar cases all over the area, so they believe it's the work of a serial killer. At night, Shiyun watches the news and sees that the man with the helmet was in the same building. And the curious thing was that he only had one line. This was very strange, especially for adults. That's why she thinks he's the suspect. Later, a motorcyclist arrives in her neighborhood, and he has the same helmet and also only has one line. That's why she thinks it could be the same person. That's why she calls the police, but learns it was just her neighbor's partner from across the street. Seeing their lines connect, she realizes everything is fine. The next day, Sona didn't go to school because she couldn't get the money and she didn't want to be bullied anymore. But the bullies open her locker and find a gift with a confession for a boy in her class. When Detective Yi comes home, Sona asks him for money and he gives her everything he had in his wallet, but it wasn't enough to pay the bullies. But the detective tells her he doesn't have any more. Then, while he was smoking, he's informed that his neighbor called to report a man with a helmet. So the detective decides to go see what it's about. When he arrives at her apartment, she gets scared when she sees so many red lines on his head. Jung tells her he just wants to talk to her. But then her neighbor comes down to tell him not to bother. She doesn't go out or talk to anyone. Even so, the detective doesn't give up and manages to get her to answer. He asks her about what she saw last night, and she tells him she just got things mixed up. At night, we see another motorcycle prowling around the neighborhood. And this time it enters Shiyun's building. When she sees the guy, she notices he has a single line. Also, the guy sees her too, so she knows this time it's really the killer. At the same time, at the police station, Detective Yi discovers that the person he saw this morning was the math teacher at his niece's school. Also, he was the ex-boyfriend of the last two victims. This was too much of a coincidence, so they want to go investigate. Before pursuing him, Detective Yi must visit his father's nursing home after being told his father was missing. But after searching for him, he found him about to jump from the rooftop. He thought that, given his illness, it would be for the best, so he wouldn't be a burden to him anymore. But fortunately, the nurses arrived to save him. Then we see that his partner had gone to investigate alone. When he enters the suspect's room, he discovers that everything was normal, except for one room that was painted entirely red. Everything was covered with red lines, like the lines Shiyun sees. When he calls his partner to inform him, the criminal hits him from behind. No matter how hard he tries to defend himself, the criminal manages to overpower him. It turns out that this criminal could see the red lines. Apparently, there was a way to remove them. Shiyun wanted to call the police, but her phone was out of battery. That's why she decides to go out to help her neighbor, who had been very kind to her. But since it was the first time she had gone out in a long time, it wasn't as easy as she thought. Meanwhile, the criminal attacks her neighbor, telling her that she is the last one he needs to purify himself. Apparently, if the person you had relations with dies, then the red line disappears. That's why the criminal attacks his ex. She, terrified, tries to defend herself, but there wasn't much she could do. Luckily, Ziyun arrives to try to stop him, but he knew she wouldn't do anything to him. So he takes the knife from her and stabs her with it, but the neighbor had already recovered and with a blow manages to take away his records. The guy goes crazy because without them, he can't see the red lines. Meanwhile, the detective had also arrived and was right in front at Shiyun's house. With his weapon, he shoots the criminal from the other side of the street. With his last breath, the criminal dies happy because he can see the last red line disappear. When everything is over, Shiyun realizes that he could also see the red lines, and that it was all thanks to his glasses. That's why he asks the detective to find them and give them to him so he can destroy them. But at that moment, Sona arrives, who apparently already knew Shiyun. She tells him that they used to be schoolmates, but after the incident, she locked herself in her house in the early morning. Shiyun thought that maybe her ability wasn't a curse after all, since she was able to save someone's life. Then she receives a message asking her to return to school, because there's someone else who can also see the world the way she does, meaning there are more people who can see the red lines. The next day, Sona's classmates start making fun of her and read her love confession in front of the whole class. That's why she gets upset and attacks the bully, but the bully was much stronger and easily knocks her down to hit her. Luckily, Teacher Kim arrives and punishes both of them. But when Sona goes back for her things, she finds a pair of glasses. When she gets home, it turns out she had only one red line. She doesn't know what it means, but when she sees that her uncle had many red lines, she gets scared. The next day, we see that Sona and her uncle didn't get along very well. And now that she can see the red lines, their relationship is even worse. When she gets to school, she looked different. Now she was more confident because she had acquired a new skill. Also, she could see that the bullies had several red lines. The leader of that group had only two, but one was connected to a teacher. When she discovers this, Sona smiles, because she thinks she found her weakness. Later, Shiyun arrives at school, but since she hasn't gone in a long time, she doesn't know what to say. For his part, the detective realizes that the killer's glasses are no longer there. That's why he goes to the school to find out if he used those glasses before committing the crimes. That's why he talks to Teacher Kim, who, upon learning that he was a killer, is surprised and tells him that she doesn't remember seeing the teacher with glasses. At the same time, Sona was being beaten again, but this time she tries to defend herself. When she was about to threaten the bully with her secret, Shiyun arrives and threatens the bully by saying she'll jump off the rooftop with her. If she keeps bothering Sona, the bully thinks she's crazy, so she promises to leave them alone. In the afternoon, Detective Yi goes to the bar that the criminal used to frequent. There he discovers that he did wear glasses. And in fact, it was very strange, because he would start counting in front of people, and that caused a few fights. Then, since the detective was very handsome, a girl from the bar takes him to her house to add another notch to her belt. For his part, Sona follows the thug, and that's how he discovers her meeting with the master and sees both of them entering a motel. That's why he takes pictures of them and then sends them to her, telling her that now she has to give him money so he won't reveal the photos. But the thug tells him that she's underage and that if he reveals the truth, she'll just say she was a victim of the master. That's why she decides to send the photos to the master and asks him for 20 million won in cash. Otherwise, she'll reveal the photos and ruin his life. Sona wanted to use that money to leave her house and stop being a burden to her uncle. At night, Shiyun thinks it must be nice to have someone who cares about you. Since the incident, she hasn't heard anything from her mother, so she thinks maybe her mother has already passed away. The next day, the teacher secretly meets with the bully to tell her that someone is blackmailing him with the photos. She tells him that it's his classmate, Sona, and that he should find a way to handle it on his own. Then we see that Sona is different now. She was more popular and was even dating her crush. Also, there were many more cases of infidelity. At school, married teachers who were sleeping with their colleagues had been discovered and were also being threatened. Sona is asked who gave them to her, and Sona replies that she only gave the ones she was given, and that she didn't give the mothers. Sona asks who gave them to her, and Sona replies that she just found them in her locker, and now they're hers. A few days later, Sona was making out with her new crush, Deki 106. But before moving to the next level, the teacher tells her that he got 20 million won, and that he will give it to her at school at midnight. But before that, Sona and her crush go to take some pictures. But it turns out that the bully was in the bathroom when they talked about the glasses and the red lines, so she plans to steal them. When she gets them, Sona was going crazy. No matter how much she looked for her glasses, she couldn't find them. That's why she calls Shiyun to demand that she return them. But she can't say more because she has to go to school before midnight. But when she arrives, she sees that the teacher didn't have the money. The teacher had come to beg Sona not to say anything because he has a wife and a son. Sona tells him he should have thought about that. Before getting involved with a student, the teacher tells her that with his salary, he can't gather that amount of money. But suddenly he gets a message someone had already sent the photos to his wife. She tells him to forget that he has a family and that she can't even consider him a human being anymore. The teacher thinks it was Sona, so furious, he throws her off the rooftop. Shiyun was nearby and sees her fall to the ground, so he calls an ambulance. Fortunately, they managed to save her life, but she was still not out of danger. Her uncle was very worried and asks Shiyun to explain everything he knows. She tells him that Sona called her and said she would go to the school at midnight, but she doesn't know anything else. She only assures him of one thing, that his niece did not try to commit suicide. Days later, the teacher didn't go to school, so the principal was furious. The other teachers were also angry because someone was blackmailing them about their infidelities. The bully was nowhere to be found either. Now we meet Teacher Wu, who would soon be leaving for Canada. That's why, to say goodbye, he visits his sister for a few days. She was very happy because he was her only family. Meanwhile, at school, Shiyun was trying to find out what happened to her friend. Then a girl arrives, who was Sona's friend. She wants to help her because she also doesn't believe that Sona tried to take her own life. Then they see a boy with glasses very similar to the ones Sona used to wear. That's why Shiyun thought they were the same. But in reality, they were just ordinary glasses, the kind that change color. The red lines were on Master Wu's desk. Someone had left them there. Teacher Kim asks them not to throw them away and says that if they're on her desk, they must be for her. When she puts them on, she starts to see. Also, when Detective Yi enters the teacher's office, he can see the red jungle that was on his head, which is why Master Wu also gets scared. It turns out that the detective had gone there to investigate his niece's case. He asked Teacher Kim to introduce him to the student who was bullying Sona, but she was missing. So he asks to speak with the boy she was dating. The boy tells him they weren't a couple, they were just hanging out. He also tells him that after they went out to take pictures, she went crazy over his glasses. And then she ran off without saying anything to him. When he checks the cameras, he realizes it was true, and that the bully took his glasses. But he can't find out more because in an alley, the girl disappears. At night, we see that Master Wu is having dinner with his brother-in-law. His brother-in-law asks him why he decided to cancel his wedding and move to Canada. He tells him that he found his fiancée with another man. His brother-in-law says it was for the best, that it was a blessing to find out before marrying her. Later, after returning from the store, he learns his brother-in-law made a call from the same building. That is, he was cheating on his sister with his neighbor. But he can't find out more because his brother-in-law won't let him. That's why, the next day, he sees that a box was left at the wrong address, so he uses that as an excuse to go downstairs. To see who his brother-in-law's lover is, that's how he finds out that it was a young and beautiful woman. So he decides to investigate further, and discovers that he had been living with both of them in the same building. Apparently, the bastard had two families. After their mother's ceremony, we found out that the sibling's father was unfaithful. That's why the master couldn't forgive his girlfriend. No matter how hard he tried, he always saw the face of his unfaithful father in his girlfriend's face. That's why he was going to Canada, to be far from her and try to get over her. For their part, the police had decided to close the Sona case and label it as a simple suicide. Detective Yi didn't agree because he knew his niece wouldn't do something like that, and he wanted to keep investigating until he found the culprit. The next day, everyone at school finds out that a teacher was dating a student, and because of that, a big scandal breaks out. Additionally, they find the teacher's body in his car. Apparently, he had also taken his own life. But again, things were too suspicious because once more, everything was too clean, as if it were a well-planned scene. That's why Detective Yi doesn't believe it's a simple suicide. Back at school, Shiyun's new friend introduces her to the class president. They become very good friends, but when they leave, they run into Detective Yi. He asks them to come with him because he has some questions for Shiyun. He wanted to know more about the glasses. She asks him to find them first, and then she'll tell him everything she knows. At night, Master Wu finds his brother-in-law who was supposedly traveling, so he follows him to see what he's doing. That's how he finds him in a romantic scene with his lover, so he calls him to ask where he is and what he's doing. He acts convincingly, telling him he's in a meeting and will talk later. When they find out which room he was in, he goes to see him and demands that he clear things up with his sister before he tells her everything. The brother-in-law, although angry, tells him that he will take care of everything and asks him to please give him a little time. The next day, Master Wu was supposed to leave, so he asks his sister if her husband talked to her. But his sister says no. That's why, while he was packing his things, Teacher Kim tells him that he needs to solve his problems before leaving the country. Then, while checking his phone, he discovers that the lover was pregnant. That's why he decides to go back to the building, because he doesn't want his sister to have the same fate as their mother. But when he arrives, it seemed like it was too late because his sister was crashing the car of the supposed lover. When Master Wu tries to stop her, we find out that actually his sister was the lover. She was his brother-in-law's wife. All this time, his sister knew about it and she agreed to be the other woman. But when Master Wu found out about his brother-in-law, he decided to end their relationship. That's why his sister was so angry, because she had lost her man. At night, Detective Yi discovers Sona's diary. That's how he discovers he can see the red lines with the glasses. That's why he asks Zion if she knows anything about it. She answers yes, that with the glasses you can see the S lines, lines that connect people. The detective obviously doesn't believe her, but she tells him that she used the glasses to blackmail teachers, and one of them could have pushed her. Then, the detective says that in several cases there were people with glasses, so there could be more than one pair of glasses going around. The next day, Zion's new friends ask her to hang out over the weekend, but she says she can't because she got a job at the neighborhood motel. Now we meet Miss May. She's a substitute teacher, and the vice principal didn't treat her well at all. But she also had a pair of glasses that showed the red lines, although she didn't use them to do anything bad. She tells her colleagues that she only takes temporary jobs until she can achieve her dream, which is to become a famous actress. That's why every weekend she put on a wig and went to the neighborhood motel to practice some characters. Shiyun worked at that motel. Miss May always asked for the same room where she practiced her character. She played a woman who had been with many men and now, after meeting someone special, wanted to leave that life behind. But reality was very different, because she only had one red line. Then we see that Detective Yi was looking for more information about Zion's past, and thus confirms that she could see the red lines since she was a child. Then he asks her how many lines Sona has. She answers that she only has one, but she doesn't know who it's connected to because it's not anyone from school. Then we see that there were more serial killers. The curious thing is that they all wore glasses and didn't have a single red line, meaning they were killing their ex-partners. This confirms that there are several glasses going around the city. The next day, we see that Miss May was in love with the music teacher, and it was with him that she wanted to connect her red line. And for him, that's who she was practicing so much for, but it was just a fantasy, because in reality, nothing was happening. The teacher also only had one red line, and apparently he wasn't interested in any other woman. Later, the class president asks Zion to go to a place where he relaxes. So they arrive at the school pool, both get in, and after swimming a bit, the class president asks her what's wrong. She tells him about the red lines. She thought he wouldn't believe her, but he tells her that he believes her because she has no reason to lie to him. After that, Zion starts to feel butterflies in her stomach and wants a red line to appear on her head. For his part, the detective had stopped being so restless because he was interested in Teacher Kim. That's why his partner finds it odd. He was always busy despite not being in a formal relationship. A few days later, we see that Miss Kim returns to the motel to practice her lines, but this time, Zion hears her. It turns out that the teacher always went to that room because there was a hole in the wall and she could see what was happening in the next room. Also, that's where she found the glasses. That's why every weekend she would stay to watch if a couple went into the next room. But that day, she was unlucky. The music teacher goes into the next room, and a few minutes later, the woman with whom he had his red string arrives. Apparently, she was a news anchor, and that's why they couldn't be together, but they still met from time to time to be intimate. For her part, Miss May had seen and heard everything. When they were done, the woman said goodbye to the teacher and told him they should meet again. The next day, at the same time and in the same room, Miss May decided to stay and wait for them again the following day. When the host arrives, Miss May knocks her out with a fire extinguisher, then takes her clothes and goes to the room where she planned to make him hers. When the music teacher sees her, he recognizes her. She tries to say the lines she had practiced so much, but the music teacher wasn't interested in her, so he tries to leave. But Miss May had put something in his water earlier. So, after taking a few steps, he collapses, knocked out, and unfortunately hits his head. The teacher puts him on the bed and tries to make him hers, but the teacher was bleeding out and soon loses his life. Miss May was disappointed, so she takes her own life in the bathtub. Hours later, Shiyun discovers the woman tied up and then finds the lifeless bodies. That's why she calls Detective Yi and tells him that the teacher was also wearing the glasses. She warns him to be careful because the glasses can change people and make them behave in a completely different way. Even so, the detective goes to look for the darn glasses, and this time, he does find them. When he puts them on, he can see. The huge number of red lines he had were so many that even he is surprised. Then we see a bit of his story. It turns out that his older brother and his wife died when he was very young, and since then, he has taken care of Sona, although he just wanted to have a normal life, without so much responsibility. That's why now he tries to get closer to his niece to make up for how bad he was in the past. That's why he brings her supposed boyfriend to see if his niece's red string connects with him. But he tells her that they never did anything, but she told him about someone she hates a lot, and that maybe that person is the one she's looking for. For his part, Shiyun was gradually starting to have a more normal life. His friends wanted to throw him a birthday party because it was coming up soon. But suddenly he gets a message from an unknown number inviting him to their 17th birthday party. Back to the detective, we see that there was a new case at his niece's school. This time for sexual assault. A girl who was an idol trainee went out drinking with a classmate and got so drunk that she lost consciousness. When she woke up, her underwear was stained with blood and she was in a different position. So she blames the boy. She said that she hadn't had sex, but the detective could see 4 red lines on her. So he thought she was lying. So they go to the school to continue investigating. And when he runs into the teacher, Kim sees that she didn't have a single red line. That's why he thinks she's as pure as spring water. This makes him think she's the one, and that's why his ears turn red. After flirting, they go to the suspect, but the student had only 1 red line. He also says that the girl looked for him and that she approached him, but that he never did anything with her because, according to him, she wasn't his type. Then he runs into Zion. She was upset because he told her to be careful with the glasses, but the detective was the one using them. Suddenly, Teacher Kim arrives. Detective Yi tries to ask her out, but she ignores him. That's how we find out that she can also see the red lines. Afterwards, the detective goes to see the chief executive officer of the entertainment agency. He says that the two of them were trainees, but the girl wasn't willing to put in more effort. She needed to do more to make up for her lack of talent. The boy, on the other hand, did work very hard, which is why he had more of a future than she did. Because of that, the detective thinks that maybe the accuser wants to ruin the boy's career. Besides, everything seemed very suspicious. She had no evidence, only her underwear, which had been washed by her mother. Also, when she opens the door, she sees that her attacker's line is not connected to hers. That's why she thinks it's a false accusation and wants to refer the case to the prosecutor's office. But when she returns home, Shiyun was waiting for her. She puts on the glasses and nothing happens. The red lines are still there. Then she tells her that her classmate's accusation might be real because a week ago she didn't have a single red line. And suddenly she showed up with 4. That's why the detective decides to investigate again. This time, they go directly to the suspect's house. That's how he discovers that he changed the sheets when they search the trash. He finds the sheets with the evidence, but as the boy said, he hadn't done anything with the girl. So they check the surveillance cameras and discover that after she fell asleep, 4 boys entered her house. When they arrived, one of them didn't have a single red line, but when he left, he had one. Does that mean they were the attackers? The next day, Shiyun finds the attackers, but the detective had also found them, so he interrogates them. But none of them want to confess their crime. That's why Detective Yi decides to take other measures. He takes the most cowardly one to scare him and force him to confess everything. After playing with him, he tells him that his friends accused him, and that he will have to take all the blame. So he decides to talk because he wasn't the only one responsible. It turns out that the one who planned everything was the apprentice of Idol. He asked them for money in exchange for letting them sleep with the girl. Seeing that the detective knows the truth, the boys confess one by one. But the one who had planned everything was calm. He knew he hadn't committed the act, so he thought he was going to get away with it. But the detective discovered that he used a drug and also took money for letting his classmates commit a crime. Also, the 4 boys accused him, so he will be in more trouble than they are. Later, Zion asks if they will be punished. The detective says that depends on justice, but thanks to the glasses, he did what he could to gather all the evidence. Because of that, she thinks that maybe her power isn't a curse. After all, later the detective's father had gotten lost again, so he had to go to the nursing home again. But this time, we see how Teacher Kim had taken him. Afterwards, it seems like it will match because I thought she would take him too, but suddenly his red line starts to move. That's how he discovers something horrifying. Her father had abused her. That's why Detective G goes crazy, starts hitting him, and tells him he's not human. Even though her father was suffering from dementia and had no idea what was happening, Detective G started to feel guilty because that probably happened when they were still living in the same house and when he was ignoring his niece. The next day, we see that he had leaked an intimate video of a girl, and it went viral in a short time. That's why she tried to end her life, but at that moment, Teacher Kim arrived and gave her a pair of glasses. When she started using them, she changed completely and discovered a way to eliminate the red lines. Meanwhile, Shiyun was about to turn 17 years old. That's why, as a gift, she asked the class president to disrespect her and have their first red line together. He was very nervous. But seeing that she was ready, they both have their first time seeing their red line. Yes, she was happy, but when she went outside, she thought that maybe, by no longer being a virgin, she would stop seeing the red lines. But it didn't turn out that way. Everything stayed the same as before. She also thought that her curse was an exaggeration. But when her boyfriend went to buy a cake, his red line disappeared. That is to say, the class president had died. He suffered a terrible accident that only ended his life. That's why she believes she's cursed and will never be with anyone. Then she receives a threat from the same unknown number, telling her to go to the school to save her friend. So she calls the detective to help her. But now she does tell us that over the years she has been receiving a letter every year on her birthday, but it wasn't a birthday greeting, it was a countdown. Was someone waiting for her to turn 17? Even so, she decides to go into the school to save her friend and stop that person. But when she gets to the classroom, something very strange happens if she rescues her friend. But when she comes out, the detective is gone. So they try to escape without him. However, no matter how far they go down the stairs, they end up in the same spot, so they head to the rooftop. Meanwhile, the detective goes up, but to a different rooftop. Here we see that Teacher Kim had formed a cult with the people who wore the glasses. They all had the same mission. They had to purify themselves before the whole world could see the red lines, because Teacher Kim planned to give the world the power of sight. Is that why so many crimes happened throughout the city? It was the members of her cult who were purifying themselves. Then we see Teacher Kim arrive. If you thought Detective Lee had a lot of red lines, Teacher Kim had a real red C in her head. She had thousands and thousands of red lines. It turns out she was behind everything. Apparently, just like Shiyun, when someone was with her, they lost their life, which is why she didn't have a single red line when others saw her. Then she tells the detective that he has to make a decision and cut his niece's red line, meaning he has to end his father's life. He doesn't want to do it and tries to take out Teacher Kim, but she was too powerful, so she takes the knife from him and ends the old man's life herself. Then the detective starts shooting at her, but she was so powerful that not even bullets could hurt her. At the same time, if she fought with her supposed friend, it turns out that she also had the glasses. That's why, after struggling, she manages to remove them. And when she breaks them, she magically returns to herself. But no matter how much they try to escape, it was already too late. Teacher Kim takes Shiyun to her world. Was she planning to use her blood as a sacrifice so that everyone could see the red lines? The teacher tells her that she was born for that and that she had been waiting for her all these years to grant the world the blessing of the red lines. Because people have the right to know the truth, even if they say otherwise on the outside. When she was about to cut her, C's mother jumps in to defend her. It turns out that she killed her husband, not because of her daughter's drawings, but because she also had the glasses and saw the red lines with her own eyes. So she apologizes to her daughter and tells her that what happened was not her fault. Then she tries to attack the teacher, but the teacher ends up stabbing her. Then, using her powers, she lifts her up, and some kind of portal absorbs her blood. Then she sends that to the earthly world, and now everyone will be able to see the lines. That one? But Teacher Kim didn't know that Yeon couldn't die, so she takes advantage of her being distracted and stabs her. But she, with a smile, tells her that it's already too late because she's already fulfilled her life's purpose. Then her disciples are freed and go crazy when they see where they were after returning to the normal world. The detective is still hypnotized by the glasses, but luckily he manages to save him. Then we see how people get excited when they see the red lines and the spectacle of the red sky, but little by little they start to understand what it's really about. That's why, months later, we see how everyone was covering their faces. No one wanted to be identified, but people who didn't have red lines could walk freely without needing to cover their faces. That was the purification that Teacher Kim talked about. Then we see that Sona was now more cheerful. Since her red lines disappeared, she knew that her attacker had paid for what he did. That was like taking a weight off her shoulders, and that's why she started getting along better with her uncle, who also seemed to have increased his red lines. In the end, we see that she was alone again, which is why she goes to visit the grave of her first love. But suddenly, Teacher Kim whispers in her ear, "This is how this story ends." I hope you enjoyed this summary. Let me know in the comments what you thought of this story. Personally, I liked it a lot because it was very original. Thank you very much for watching the video until the end. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. See you in the next story.